0 volts to ulit. Close ulit to. Kung close ulit yan, class, ang voltage mo sa load is naka 5 volts ka pa rin. So, hindi yan magbababa. Ito pa rin ang voltage mo sa output. Okay? Now, parating na po, class, yung ating negative half cycle. So, sabi natin dito, no, during the negative half cycle, let's analyze during the negative half cycle because we only analyze using the positive half cycle. So let's have here during the negative half cycle what happens. So during the negative half cycle, what happens now is, let me just redraw the circuit. So yan yung sinasabi ko, class, no? Kaya every time na marami naging inquiry, di lang students, may faculty din. So let me just draw the circuit. We have the series R. We have the diode, which is simply pointing up. If I remember it, naka-series pala. We have here the battery. And then pointing to the left, to the right, we have the load. Okay, ayan. This is our circuit. Now, let's analyze this one using the negative half cycle. What happens during the negative half cycle? Ideally, so negative, positive. But take note, class, the input for your negative half cycle starts with 0 again. Start with 0 again. Yun. Start with 0. So meaning to say, once this is simply equal to 0, class, once this is simply equal to 0, 0 volts. Okay, the diode is still closed. Agree? If it is closed, then the voltage across your RL is simply equal to 5 volts. Agree? During the negative half cycle. So that's the reason why here in your output voltage, kahit naka-0 na to, may voltage ka pa rin dito na 5 volts. Why? Because naka-0 yung input voltage. Now let's proceed now as we increase the negative value. Let's increase this one to -1, -2, -3, and so on. What will happen? That's the next question. What if this becomes 1 volt? We have -1 volt. Okay? So what happens now, class, here is 1 volt, 2 volts, 3 volts, okay, until it reaches 5 volts. So what happens? As you can see, this is now series opposing na voltage. If it is series opposing, nagsusubtract po tayo, which is discussed during your high school years, I believe, if you listen. If may laruan ka ng kapatid mo, you will see some batteries in series. Say for instance, class, if you're good observer, the polarity of your battery ng laruan ng kapatid mo are alternating. Kapag alternating yan at tigtuwa 1.5 each yan, class, what happens? What happens is nag-a-add up ang voltage niyan such that ang voltage across niyan is 4.5 volts. Okay? Because the polarity are series aiding. Pag series opposing, yung hindi alternate, like this one, this is not an alternate. You have positive, negative, negative. So magsusubtract lang siyan. So expect that the voltage mo sa load is simply equal to 4 volts. So pababa. Pababa ang voltage mo. If this is 1 volt, so we have here 4 volts. If it is 2 volts, so 5 minus 2, this is 3 volts. It is 4 volts. So 5 minus 4, you give 1. If it is 5, it is simply equal to 0. Okay? So, ibig sabihin pala, class, habang bumababa yung value, -1, -2, it reaches the -5, sabihin natin, ito yung -5 volts. No? This area, this line is the -5 volts. Doon pa lang siya magzi-0. So, nasan ba yung -5 volts? Ayun, dito ang -5 volts. So, doon pa lang siya babaksak to 0. Okay? Tapos, what happens? Dahil malaki na masyado to, -6 volts na siya, so yung negative, pagka-negative nito is mas malaki kaysa sa pagka-positive nito na kina-close niya, what happens with your diode is ino-open niya. Okay? Once na-open yan, class, ang current mo dyan is simply equal to 0. So, meaning to say, class, at 5 volts, no, onwards, at 5 volts, at negative 5 volts onwards, your diode is open and your voltage across your RL is simply equal to 0 because your current is simply equal to 0. So meaning to say, class, meaning to say, for the whole period, class, for the whole period nito, naka-open ang diode mo. So ibig sabihin, 0 volts yan. Pero, pag pumalo na ng 5 volts, then going to 0, pabalik yan sa 5 ulit. Ayan. And then it will simply follow the same. Ayan. So that is the effect kapag meron kang battery. So ito pa lang po ang final answer natin. So this is just our final answer. Dito pa lang po ang final answer mo. Okay? Nandun siya sa taas ng 5 volts kung papansinin. Okay? Nandiyan sa taas ang 5 volts mo kung papansinin mo. Tapos magmula rito hanggang dyan, yan ang 20 volts mo. Okay? 5 volts po to, mga 5 volts yan. It's because you have the effect, that is the effect of the battery. Okay? So, the next example that we have is, so before I proceed, if you have some questions, please ask questions before we proceed with the next example. If none, you may type none. Okay, we will now proceed with the next example. So here we call this one as example number 1. We will now proceed with an example, another example. Let me call this one as example number 2. Okay, so with this, with example number 2 that we have, we will be solving this one. Okay, same circuit. We are asked to find for the output voltage. Okay. So it says here, find the output voltage. So sana makopy ko ng buo, pero hindi ko makopy. So take note, the input voltage here that we have is not a peak-to-peak, but rather we have 20 volts and negative 10 volts. Take note, we also have a rectangular wave. We have a similar circuit. Okay? So yun po yung pinagkaiba. Yung input voltage po natin ang pinagkaiba. Okay, let me just draw similar circuit. The only difference is the input voltage. So we have here, again, the battery. Also have the diode. Then we have the resistor R. This is your input voltage. We can draw in this manner. And this is now your output voltage, which can be drawn in this manner. So this is your RL, and the given is 5 volts. What is important here is you have to determine what type of waveform was used. So we have used here a rectangular wave. Another important to note is the voltages. So there is a different magnitude on the positive peak and the negative peak. So this is your Vin, okay? And this is now negative 10 volts. So that is what is important, okay? So with that, let's analyze this one using a positive half cycle, okay? So during the positive half cycle, how do we analyze this one during the positive half cycle? Now take note, the meaning of this input voltage is that the input does not start from zero, but rather the input start immediately with the magnitude of 20 volts. So what does it mean? So it simply means, class, if this is your diode, okay, let me just redraw. So we will still retain the original circuit. So meaning to say your input voltage here starts with 20 volts during the positive half cycle. It starts with automatically 20 volts when the time is simply equal to zero, okay, or initial. So this is still 5 volts. So in that case, what is the voltage across your RL? Pansinin, you have negative, positive, negative, positive. So this is negative, positive. And then we are talking about ideal approximation. So we disregard the voltage drop across your diode. So meaning to say, class, 20 plus 5, that is your voltage across your RL. If you are not convinced, you may have the KBL. So using KBL, we can have here negative 20 volts, okay? Negative 5 volts, okay? If it is positive, then the drop across your RL is also positive, plus VRL equated to 0. Therefore, your VRL is simply equal to 25 volts. There you go. It's because the polarity of the input voltage and the polarity of the battery are alternating. If they are alternating, they are adding. If they are not alternating, they are opposing. So there is a subtraction. Okay? Now, let's draw now the output waveform. That is what is important here. You can never draw the output waveform if you have not yet analyzed or if you have not solved the problem. So this is now your 20 volts. And this is now your output. So how does your output look like? So pansinin po natin sa input, doon pa lang sa initial value ng 0 at time equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Ang voltage mo is automatically 20 volts na. Pero sa output, pag 20 volts yan, yung output mo is not 20 volts, but rather it's 25 volts, mas mataas. It's 25 volts. Why? Because of the effect of the battery. And that is, we are just talking about positive half cycle. During the negative half cycle, this is 10 volts, negative 10 volts. Ano kaya rito? So let's check what happens during the negative half cycle. So let's proceed on this side. During the negative half cycle, what happens? Okay? We will need to analyze it by redrawing the circuit for us to be provided with a circuit that we can actually write over. So ito yung output natin. Okay. Now, pansinin po natin dito sa input voltage natin. Sa input voltage natin, okay? At this point, automatic negative 10 volts na siya. May value na siya, negative 10 volts. Hindi lang siya flat na 0, negative 10 volts na siya agad. So, ibig sabihin sa negative half cycle class, this is negative, that is positive. Automatic 10 volts na yan. Okay? So, kung magki-KBL ka, this is your 5 volts. KBL ka dyan, we have positive 10 volts, okay? So, automatic, ang alam ko dyan, 5 volts lang yung VRL. Kasi, na-check ko na negative to, tapos negative yan, opposing yan. Pero if you are not convinced, you can have your KBL. So, positive 10 volts, you have negative 5 volts. What is the polarity drop here? This is negative, that is positive. So, you have negative VRL equal to 0. Then, we have what? We have VRL is simply equal to what? So, dilipat sa kabila, 5 volts. Ayan. So, during the negative half cycle pala, class, our output, no? Our output is 5 volts kung nag-KBL ka. Pero dyan, pag nangyari yan, class, automatic mali ka na. This is wrong. Why? Because hindi mo muna inanalyze yung circuit. Let's check. Sabi natin kanina, automatic 10 volts na to. Hindi man siya mag-i-start sa 0, automatic 10, no? So yung magnitude niya 10. Unlike sa sine wave kasi pag ganyan class eh. Start ka muna sa 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here class, bigla ka ng 10 volts negative. Okay? Meron ka ng agad na height. Meron ka na kaagad na height. Sandali lang. Ayusin ko kasi naka-positive magnitude ang ginawa natin. So, ulitin ko. Unlike sa sine wave class, ito, meron ka munang 0, meron kang negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. Pero here, unlike dito sa 10 volts class, okay, meron kang ano dito, meron kang automatic na 10 volts. Wala ka mang 1, 2, 3, automatic 10 volts. So, meaning to say, no, halimbawa, solve ka lang ng solve, hindi ka nag-a-analyze, mali na yung approach mo. Why? Because the negative 10 volts is greater than the positive 5 volts. Bigla na kasi may 10 volts. So that negative 10 volts will simply open the circuit. If it is open, then the current is simply equal to 0. Then your voltage is simply equal to 0. So meaning to say, use during the negative half cycle, your voltage sa output is simply equal to 0 volts. Why? Because the magnitude is automatically negative 10 volts. Hindi man siya dumaan sa 1, 2, 3, 4. Kasi straight line po ang ating input voltage, no, vertical. So meaning to say, if we're going to draw now our output waveform, okay, output waveform natin during the negative half cycle, negative 10 volts is simply 0. Hanggang saan siya 0? Hanggang saan siya 0? Ayan. Dito siya 0. 0 volts. If you have some questions, you may raise them now. So this is now the required output versus the input voltage. If you have some questions, you may raise them now. No? So you cannot get a correct waveform not unless you have a correct solution. You cannot get a correct solution not unless you have a correct analyzation. So the chat box is now open for some questions and clarifications.